I'm here with retired Vice-Marshal Sean Bell, advisor for Universal Defence and Security Solutions. Sean, great to be with you again, and doing something slightly different today, which is to look at NATO then and now, 3 decades ago and today, and the expansion there, ahead of President Biden's trip, of course, to Poland this weekend, and just try and understand how Russia might interpret it, or really the spin, let's face it, that Vladimir Putin might put on it. This is a snapshot of the mid-1990s, a couple of years after the Soviet Union fell, Sean, and talk us through the sort of main points to note here.
Well, first of all, NATO was essentially a defensive alliance, so an attack on one is an attack on all. And after all, the defence of your nation is #1 priority for any country, anywhere in the world. The very success of NATO at the time was that, yes, a few more countries wanted to join, but I think the key point here is that big buffer between the eastern edge of NATO and the western edge of Russia. There
were 16 members then, including the US and Canada. Let's jump now to today, and clearly that buffer has disappeared.
Yes, and I think you have to overlay on this the fact that in the late 90s, Putin rose to power as the president as well. So he's been sort of presiding over a lot of this era, 23 years in power. At the end of the sort of Soviet era of the Russian Federation, as it were, the number of new states emerged. They'd been used to a really difficult, stagnant economy, and these new states were looking for growth, prosperity and freedoms. Some of them looked east and formed alliances with Russia. Some of them looked west and looked to the Warsaw Pact, the Baltic states, and looked to the European Union and NATO for that security, prosperity and freedom.
And always important to reiterate, of course, it's a defensive organisation, and those countries that joined in the intermittent period sought to join as opposed to outright expansion from the original members. Sean, give us some specifics. For example, maybe what British NATO troops might be doing in some of these countries, which countries in and around this current war.
Yeah, so NATO being defensive, it doesn't mean you have to wait until somebody's attacked before you do anything. So the Putin invading Ukraine has heightened the threat to the eastern flank of NATO. So we've seen NATO bolstering the eastern flank with land forces, maritime forces to the south, and of course air forces. And the UK undoubtedly has got Typhoons operating up in the Baltic states, and they have a variety of different basing options they can choose, which include in country or maybe as far south as Cyprus.
Interesting. And, of course, one of the factors that we've been discussing is if Putin wants to stop this expansion, invading countries doesn't help that. And we've seen a big shift in opinion polls in some of those countries like Finland and Sweden as to whether they want to join. Let's now dive in on Ukraine in particular and just snapshot where we stand at the moment. And the good thing, tiny positive of all of this, Sean, is that the red here hasn't expanded too much in the last week or so.
No, and I think although the humanitarian crisis continues, I think Mariupol still shows a bellwether of Ukrainian resistance. And given the difficulties that Putin's forces are evidently having trying to take Mariupol, it's pretty evident from Putin's perspective that Kiev will be even more difficult and therefore potentially a bridge too far. I think the positive thing as well we're seeing, though, is not just the Ukrainian military, it's their civilian population as well. And they're not only defending, they're also fighting back. There's reports now, certainly up towards Kyiv, of some areas being retaken by the Ukrainian forces. So it's evident that their spirit has not been dampened, but has been bolstered by the events over the last few days.
Sean Bell, thanks so much. That's the latest on day 27.